Hey, this is Davin with Hagerty and our Redline rebuild updates. Today I'm working on our Cadillac heads. You can see I got the cylinder heads back from Thoroughbeast Machine Shop. All right, so the first step in the process, Mark put in fresh guides and then subsequently cut out the exhaust and put in hardened seats, and then cut both the exhaust and the intake seats as far as a fresh sealing surface is concerned. And then the last step in the process was decking the head. All right, as soon as I get these cleaned up and off to paint, then I'll be back over in the assembly room finishing up the short block. All right, I got my cylinder heads all cleaned up and they are masked and off the paint. So that process is in process. Now, next thing for me to do here is to take the rings and make sure they're gonna be fit properly into the bore. Now, these are not file fit rings, but it's always a good idea to put them into the bore. All right, I gotta put them where I'm at. Put them into the bore and then set them down in the hole with this ring spacer. So basically sets it at an even distance down. You always check it where the rings run. Use a feeler gauge to check that in gap. And again, these are not meant to be file fit, but you always want to double check, because at the end of the day, if the ends come together, it doesn't matter if they're a file fit or not. You have an engine that's not going to be happy. So the number I use is on the top rings. You tend to have them open a little bit more because they're getting most of the heat, so the ring end gap is going to close up more. So the gap on the top will be more than the bottom or the second ring. I use 4.5 thousandths per inch of cylinder, so roughly a 4-inch bore, talking 18 thousandths on the top and 16 then on the secondary. Now that is the minimum, so if it's a little bit more than that, it's fine. Now, we don't want it excessive, but a little bit more is fine. So this happened to be a, let's see, I grabbed the top ring. So top ring again should be 18 thousandths. This is my 18 thousandths feeler gauge. Slide it in between that gap, and I'm definitely a little bit more, it's probably more like 19, so that's excellent. If for some reason that gap is not enough, you use one of these ring filers and you literally bring it in, push it up against this edge, set your kind of a stop here to hold things, and then just basically wind this. And you want to go this way, but you spin that shaves off a little bit at a time, go really slow, and then also take a little hand file and clip the edges so you don't take a burr and then run it up and down the bore, because that's not good for it either. So just a little bit of details on that. We've done it in the past on multiple projects, so you can always look back and look at those types of things. These are not file fit rings. I restate that. These are for the bore that this block is machined to. However, there's machining variation relative to the rings. So in number 2 cylinder here, fits perfect, 18, no problem. Go to number 4, it's too tight. It's probably closer to 16 thousandths. Get back here to 6. Again, it's still too tight, but it's not as tight as this one. And then back here at 8, 8 and 6 are about the same. So here happens to be a 16 thou, just to prove my point. And it's actually a little tighter than 16 because it makes it a little bit further than half the width of the ring. And this one still doesn't go in. So this is probably even 14. So again, point is, check everything. One thing I would tell somebody is, you are building an engine. You are not assembling it. There is a big difference between those two words. So just keep that in mind. Go through, double, triple check everything. And of course you'll be fine. And it's fun. Turn the music on. And take a shave off. right, last one. Beautiful. All right, so all of our rings are now appropriately gapped. We obviously verified them, and they all needed a little bit, with the exception of about 2 of them. So it's a good thing we checked. You can do the same thing on the oil control rings. Go through, put them in the hole, and double check them as well. They basically, if you can visually see a gap, they're going to be fine, because they usually have quite a bit. So I don't get too concerned about those. On to the pistons. Get the pistons all laid out on the table, and then start assembling all the rings. Now note that as you file fit these relative to the bores, yes, the bores are identically the same, but you file fit them relative to a bore. It'd be kind of foolish to just mix them up then and not keep them relative to the bore. So that's why you'll see I got numbers on the table. And of course, keeping them separated relative to the top ring and then the second ring, because it makes a difference when you put them in. So here we go, get some pistons. Ooh, that's heavy. We did not buy the lightweight ones. There they are, in all their glory. First piston's in the hole, the rod is torqued to the crankshaft, we are good. And what that really makes me feel good about is now I really am going on the assembly process of putting the rest of this stuff into the block. Now granted, I'm gonna continue to build things if I run into a problem, right? So here's the deal. Here's what I'm doing. I am taking piston rod assembly and I am installing the rings. So how I'm gonna go about this is I'm gonna put my oil control ring in here, and I'm going to put the gap to the bottom. So bottom meaning as it's installed into the block. So that would be the bottom side. And then I'll take one of the support rails, and you start with the bottom, and I'm going to put that gap way up top. And then these, they're thin enough, so you just, and they're steel, so you just roll these around. They're a spring steel material. And then when you get to the end, just be careful you don't drag it down the side of the piston. You're trying to minimize any damage during assembly. And then I'll take the top rail and just rotate it 90 degrees from the other one or thereabouts. And again, roll that down. So that ring's on. Now I'll grab my second ring. Of course, as you're doing this, you're making sure you don't have any dirt on them and all that, fuzz, anything you can catch. Use a ring expander, pull it open again just enough to clear the head of the piston and get it set down into that ring gland, and now the top ring. Now the top ring in this particular case does not have any index mark, so it does not have a mark that says this is the top, meaning this ring is symmetric, so it doesn't really matter which direction it goes on, meaning this way or this way. And into that gland. Now I do need to have my rod cap off and out of the way, and this is a great time to come in and lube up not only the bearing, because you want to have lube, assembly lube on the bearing, and I like to get it over on the side as well, because you have to remember that this is butting up against not only the crankshaft and it's also going to the mating rod. So you want some lubrication in between the two. And then you're going to, you may as well while you're here, if you remember the sequence, you can always do it just before, but take some of the lube for the threads and have that on them as well. Now, one thing lots of people will tell you, and quite honestly, all you have to do is be paying attention. You'll see several times where people will take a special little sleeve and put it over the bolts, or they'll use a piece of 3/8 tubing and use that. And quite honestly, all you're doing is you're putting some sort of protection over the top of these threads. So as you put your piston down in the hole, you don't ram the bolt into the top of the crankshaft and then of course score that crankshaft. What I like to do is I stick it down in the hole and I just guide that down there. I'm not doing a power press and trying to nail it 4 inches at a time. I'm taking and tapping it down slowly. I got plenty of opportunity to hold it in place. The key is don't forget. So this one's all ready to go into the hole with exception of oiling last minute. But what I want to show you is there's a couple different ways. You have to compress these rings, right? They want to stay open. And the reason they stay open is there's tension out because they're trying to make a seal against the bore. If they collapse, you don't have any compression. It would completely defeat the purpose. So what you have to do to get them in is collapse them so they will clear, basically go into the hole. Remember we had that in gap that we just set? You're going to kind of close it up just ever so slightly at least from its free state to get into the hole. There's a couple different ways to do that. You can attempt, and I do say attempt, you can attempt to try to put these in and push them with your fingers, but you're going to have a whole lot better luck than I have ever had doing that. I know people that try it and have some success, but there's a couple different ways to do it using some specialized tools. At the end of the day, they do the same job. They compress that ring. They are ring compressors. So the first style is, I'll call this spring steel deal. It's got a couple bands on it, and you use a little handle to get it large enough for your piston, and then you bring it tight against it. And of course, you're gonna have it setting up on here first. I usually take and set my piston down in the hole, and then I have this large enough so I'm not changing my orientation of where the ring gaps are at, but it slides down over the top of it. Then you bring this in and tighten it up, and you've seen it in multiple videos. We've used it a lot in the past, and this is kind of my good old standby, if you will. So it does multiple sizes. It's very forgiving from a size standpoint. And then you also have this style that basically does the exact same thing. You would drop it over the rings, and then you use these pliers type of setup, and you have this on here. Now, I find this can be a little cumbersome, mostly because I'm not used to using it. But the idea is you would come in, you would tighten it up around the piston, and then again tap the piston down in the hole slowly. Last thing you want it to do is the edges to come out and then whack the top of your block deck and then break your rings, and you're starting over. So one of the things I don't like about it, this style, is I have to be very cautious of where my ring gaps are at. As you can see, there's a gap in this. And of course, if that ring gap falls in there, then it's a potential place where that little edge would kick out and then whack the top of the block. But if you have something where if you look way back, we bought this actually when we put together the Harley motor, because the Harley motor, the jug had to go down over the top of it. So you certainly could not have something that was wound around the piston that couldn't come off from the side, where that's where this works here, right? Because you could basically get the jug started and then pull this out of the way and everything would fall down. So that's a good spot where those are used. Now, if you're going to be doing, let's say, enough of these to warrant a specialized sleeve, so this is a tapered sleeve. It's larger here, goes down to the size of the bore, and you can see this is a 4-inch 030, so 30 thousandths over bore. And it would set, you actually you could set it here, then drop your piston down on there. And of course you got to squeeze them just a little bit to get them into that hole. That lead-in's not quite that big because the rings are way out. but then you drop it down and again, slowly tap everything down. But this is very dedicated to the size. So you are not gonna put a 4-inch 20 over bore piston through this, and a 60 over isn't gonna work either, only the 30s. So you're kind of a little tied there, but what's nice for me, I'll say, is that's a very common bore relative to small block Ford and the small block Chevy and probably the Chryslers too. Okay, so that's that. I got 7 more to go. Cue the time lapse. All right, look at that. So, pistons are installed. That's a huge step in the short block process here. So, this is looking really good. I'm happy. This is the most nerve-wracking as far as I'm concerned because you're setting all those clearances and relying on parts coming in to be where they're supposed to be at, because it will make or break the whole deal. So we're good there. Now, next step in this process is, obviously I need to put the oil pan on here, but I need to put the timing cover on and get the chain on. But I also need an oil pump. So I'm gonna cover this for right now and move over here. So typically speaking, one does not rebuild their oil pump until they're not available. So I got a rebuild kit here, and we'll go through and I'm going to replace the gears and replace the spring and the bypass and all that type of thing. So we're gonna go through and completely rebuild this. Now, something that was really interesting when I tore this apart, okay, so this function is what creates oil pressure, okay? It spins within this cavity, and based on how physics works, this makes oil pressure out. This other half here has this piece with some wipers on it, right? And as I was tearing this down, I was like, wow, that's really odd. I've never seen anything like this. I honestly had no idea what this was for until yesterday. And I kind of went along the lines of, I'll just put it back together the way it was, and is what it is. And I'll deal with not knowing. Maybe it's some sort of pre-prime relative to the pump. Who knows? However, for those of you that are Cadillac aficionados, already know this, and I know you're chomping at the bit to yell and scream what it is. For those that you don't, this is a vacuum pump. Why is there a vacuum pump within the oil pump? Well, I'm not sure how they got there, but the idea is, as the oil pump is spinning, this vacuum pump is spinning, creating vacuum, never guess it, to run the windshield wipers. Yes, windshield wipers. So later on in the 60s at least, they still had vacuum relative to the windshield wipers, but it was running off a manifold vacuum. I'm guessing at some point somebody said, does it really make sense to fix my wipers to drop the oil pan? Because that's what we would have to do. So just a little interesting tidbit. We're putting it back the way it was, and it's just a new point of knowledge, I guess. So let's move on. We are on to putting the timing chain on. So, pretty simple, more or less. you have a big gear on your camshaft and you have a small gear on your crankshaft. There is a keyway to go in here, then that holds the gear from spinning freely. It is got a very light press fit, so I'll use a installer to push it on. Do not use a hammer to drive it this way. It raises havoc with your thrust bearing. And then of course the keyway I will have to tap in ever so slightly, but I'm going to use very little amount of force to get there. And then of course this has a slinger setup on the crankshaft, and then of course a seal with some RTV sealant on there. Put the cover on, use some bolts, and lastly install the harmonic balancer, again with an installer. So let's do it. Only trick here now, this will probably just go on as it is. Won't take much. All right, so the key to putting your timing chain and gears on are there's dimples to line up. So your crankshaft, in this case, because we got it upside down, will be at the number 6 position as far as that little dot. And then the cam gear will be at the 12 o'clock position. All right, so you want to line up these two dimples. So in the orientation we're in right now, the crankshaft is at the 6 o'clock position, and then the cam is at the 12 o'clock position. Now, if you've never had anything other than a digital watch, you'll have no clue what I just said. Just put them close. We are exactly an oil pump and the oil pan on away from having this short block done. So I'm getting right after it because I want this done. It's time to go home. All right, so there is the vacuum line. So remember, this is the vacuum pump for the windshield wipers. On the other end of the oil pump, this is the vacuum line that comes down into the block. Obviously, it has to transfer through. So instead of going through the oil pan, it goes into the block and then actually comes out of this port right here. I have a plug in it for right now, but that's where you'll tap in to make your windshield wipers run. Interesting. All right, there we have it. So here is our short block is together. So that's oil pan minus heads. to the block, and pistons are in. As you can see, we do not have any lifters in yet, but our camshaft is in, and we are ready to rock next time. So this part's done. It's the weekend, and well, I gotta go home, get my work done, and I know you do too. So get out in the shop, enjoy your projects, and again, if you don't have a project, take some time and find one, for gosh sakes. See ya. Looks good. Although it's just a towel now.